Risk manager workflows on Aladdin begin with daily risk reporting to provide oversight across a broad set of funds. With this information, risk managers can drill into outlier risk figures and conduct analyses on what might have contributed to the risk numbers in question. Additional use cases include conducting stress tests through the creation of prospective market changes, running trend analyses to observe fund trajectories, modeling what-if changes to a portfolio, comparing ex-ante risks to realized returns, and many more. Moreover, users can export data directly into Excel for ad hoc analyses. Aladdin even offers an Excel plugin known as ATX to help stitch together broad datasets for customized risk monitoring and analysis. In this overview, I will assume the role of a fixed income risk manager and showcase how Aladdin can help with the first use case mentioned, risk oversight and the investigation of a drift in portfolio risk over the course of the month. The portfolio risk model on Aladdin seeks to determine the downside loss of a security, sector, portfolio, or portfolio group based on exposures to market risk factors by answering the question, what is the maximum amount my portfolio could lose with a given degree of confidence over a given time horizon? These market risk factors are explanatory factors used to represent the volatility or standard deviation of a security's returns. More risky assets have a higher volatility of returns. In other words, larger fluctuations in gains and losses. Similarly, less risky assets have a lower volatility of returns. In other words, smaller fluctuations in gains and losses. Accordingly, securities with a higher volatility of returns should be associated with factors that have a higher volatility of returns themselves, and these securities will have greater exposure to a given factor. Ultimately, a factor model is utilized to create intuition around where portfolio evidences over or under exposure to market indicators, being that common themes and risk bets can be more easily identified along factor dimensions than security dimensions. Moreover, a factor-based model handles the complexity of newly issued securities that have no historic pricing data. With a factor model, historical returns are based on factor levels, not security pricing. Consequently, a new security in the marketplace can be modeled and evaluated on a risk basis, even if there is only a single price available. Security exposures are generated based on the security setup, as well as its analytical attributes, for example, OAS, spread duration, etc. This is best understood through an example. So let's consider a 10-year investment-grade corporate bond in the pharmaceutical sector. We'll begin with the qualitative logic first. It's a corporate bond, so the primary risk drivers of its risk will be rates, based on exposure to the various key rate points, and spread levels, based on the spread of the instrument over the risk-free curve. It's an investment-grade corporate, so it will map to investment-grade corporate factors. It's also an investment-grade bond from the pharmaceutical sector, so it will map to the investment-grade pharmaceutical factor. And lastly, it matures in 10 years, so it will map to a 10-year maturity factor. This logic can be seen in the report on the screen, and we can zoom in on these factors by expanding the USD cash bonds buckets. As you can see, we have our 10-year industrial maturities factor, our industry factor, as well as the corporate attributes factor, noting the liquidity risk of this bond. This type of thought process serves to ensure that there is market intuition around the risk factors used to model securities risk. Once the factor map is determined, the actual exposure to each of these factors must be calculated. The exposure or sensitivity to a market factor will be based on the type of factor we have mapped to. A rates factor has sensitivity to duration. A spread factor has sensitivity to spread duration and spread. An equity factor has sensitivity based on a security's fundamental attributes relative to a universe representing a given fundamental attribute. Factor levels here represent market data through which returns can be approximated by changes in this data. Rates factors, for example, have levels that correspond to yield curve rates at key rate points. Spread factors have levels that correspond to the aggregate spread of a representative universe relative to the government curve or another representative curve. For example, the US pharmaceutical IG level is derived from a universe of IG pharmaceutical bonds from the US market. The spread of these securities relative to the Treasury curve is measured daily and used as the representative level for any securities mapped to the factor. Understanding factor levels will help in the interpretation of credit beta, which is detailed a little bit later. In the next column on the screen, we have factor volatility. Factor volatility is essentially the standard deviation of factor returns. Many modeling techniques are used, however, to make the derivation of volatility more complex and indicative of market behavior. The calculation begins by calculating the return of each factor from the levels. For spread factors, it is a ratio. For yield factors, it is a simple difference. The returns are then processed to each have a decay factor, giving more recent events a greater impact in the calculation of volatility. These settings can be toggled according to user specification. Credit beta, in the next column, reflects the relative riskiness of the bonds in the portfolio mapped to a given factor to the bonds in the estimation universe used to calculate that given factor. For example, if the credit beta is greater than 1, then the bonds in the portfolio generally have higher spreads in the estimation universe. Mathematically, the metric is derived from the exposure contribution of each security that maps to the given factor, multiplied by the OAS of each of these securities, then divided by the product of the total exposure to that factor and the factor level. This formula provides the exposure-weighted spread of the bonds mapping to the factor relative to the spread of the factor estimation universe. Because the exposure is defined as the spread duration contribution and the credit beta captures relative spread risk, the credit beta can be applied with the absolute factor volatility and the factor exposure to arrive at a standalone risk associated with DXS rather than spread duration. Lastly, the risk contribution is determined by considering the correlations between each factor. This accounts for the diversification benefit of being exposed to various market risks as opposed to being concentrated in a single risk factor. Correlations are determined by first calculating the covariance between each factor, which is derived from the time series of factor returns. The covariance is then normalized by the product of the factor volatility of each factor, producing a correlation coefficient between -1 and 1. A classic example of the impact of correlations can be seen between rates and spreads. Typically, as returns from rates go up, spread returns go down, meaning that some of the rates risk of corporate bonds is offset by their spread risk. With this understanding of the factor model, I can now more effectively manage the risk of my firm's portfolios on Aladdin. Now let's dive into a few ways in which a risk manager might leverage Aladdin to go about their daily workflows. Aladdin offers several applications to assist in the risk oversight of fixed income funds. As I do this, I will be executing the following jobs: determining the maximum amount my portfolio could lose with a given degree of confidence over a given time horizon, reviewing funds for any outsized changes in risk, and determining sources of risk from factors, securities, and even sectors. Beginning to explore a flexible portfolio risk, exposure, and performance reporting tool, I can review funds across a large reporting structure for any deviations from prior month-end figures. In the Portfolio Group Summary widget, here renamed to Month-End Change Summary, I can apply custom highlighting to quickly discern which funds have had outsized deviations in fixed income risk measures since the previous month-end. First, I see that BRS INT1 has seen a 33 basis point increase in risk since the prior month-end, with no large change across fixed income analytics such as duration, spread duration, and OAS. While there does appear to be an outflow, that may not necessarily correspond to the change in risk. As a result, I will need to review this fund in greater detail. Moving through the remaining funds that exhibit highlighting, BRS plus 1 has a similar change in risk to that of BRS INT1, but the drift in fixed income analytics attributing to the movement in risk is more discernible. This fund will also need to be reviewed. It might be the case that the drivers of risk change in BRS INT1 are the same of that of BRS plus 1. Lastly, BRS plus 3 exhibits massive shifts in risk. However, it's pretty clear that these changes are driven by a large outflow. The outflow may have been the result of a large redemption or the segmenting of this fund into two smaller funds for better portfolio management. Starting with BRS INT1, I can review the remainder of my risk oversight dashboard for any obvious contributions to the risk change of the fund. Both the sector weight change and top 5 issuer exposure change widgets show no large shifts in weights, meaning that I will need to review this fund in isolation to determine what might be driving the risk change. To get additional details on what prompted the change in risk on BRS INT1, I will move into Portfolio Risk Tools, or PRT. PRT allows users to conduct detailed risk analyses, provides comprehensive stress testing capabilities, and hosts a great deal of risk factor data. To begin my detailed analysis of BRS INT1, I will run a comparison report between T-1 and the previous month end. The subsequent report attributes portfolio risk changes into changes in the economy and changes to factor exposures. Economy changes are represented by the changes in factor levels and factor volatilities. Based on the output report, I see that the risk change is split pretty evenly between exposure changes and economy changes, and the top factor contributors to these changes come from the rates factor bucket. Drilling in further, key rate factors in the USD interest rates bucket show a considerable contribution to the exposure change, with the Treasury 7-year, Treasury 10-year, and Treasury 15-year factors being the largest contributors. In the economy space, Each of the key rate factors contribute about 1 basis point to the economy change, as indicated by the slight change in factor volatility. Given that it is not entirely uncommon for USD rates to fluctuate in this capacity, the question remains, why did the exposures change? To help me get further information, I can click on the hyperlinked exposure value for any one of the factors to see which securities map to this factor. Taking the Treasury 10-year as an example, I could see the weight, exposure contribution, and risk contribution associated with the top contributors. To compare these values to the previous month-end report, I will need to go through the same steps, but with the previous month-end as my analysis date. The resulting report, when compared to the exposure report as of T-1, evidences relatively similar weights with changing security exposure values. This indicates that the actual duration values of these assets changed from the end of last month to now. In order to investigate this further, I will need to go back into Explorer to look at asset level pricing, security details, and fixed income analytics. And the reports currently on the screen, scrolling to the right in each of them, indicates that the exposure contribution, particularly in FNA 030166, changed greatly. Back in Explorer, I can apply a normalized filter on the top contributor to the Treasury 10Y exposure, CUSIP FNA 030166. With this, I can directly see that prepayment decreased by 0.12 over the time horizon of the analysis, effectively increasing the duration by about half a year. This is reflected in the key rate duration profile and explains the shift in exposures that I saw in the security contributors to factor exposure reports. I can apply the same analysis to the other assets in the top 10 contributor bucket. Effectively, I am seeing the impact of the economy change on the duration value of my fund. As rates increase, the price drops on MBS due to a decrease in prepayment. Consequently, these MBS assets get more sensitive to further rate changes, and the duration lengthens from month-end till now. Back in PRT, in my comparison report, I also noticed that spreads were a major contributor to the total risk change. Here, however, the economy change seemed to be the main driver. A change in TBA moneyness factor levels increased the factor volatility of select moneyness factors. Consequently, with relatively small exposure changes, these factors still engendered a change to the fund's risk profile. Continuing with the same example CUSIP as before, I can see that the OAS and the spread duration changed enough to contribute some to the overall risk change, but not substantially, as was the case for rates exposure. The factor volatility for these factors, however, did increase by about 16% though. As evidenced in this analysis, the Aladdin Risk and Reporting Toolkit provides a great deal of functionality for monitoring and investigating risk outliers. This style of investigation can subsequently be applied to BRS+1 or any other fund of interest. The application suite is able to report on both security and factor-based analytics, allowing risk managers to seamlessly review a broad set of funds with an outlier-based review process.